At my father's while reading, I realized something that made the entire room suddenly feel colder. My name wasn't there. The words echoed quietly in my mind as attorney Michael Carter adjusted his glasses and continued reading from the neatly printed document in his hands. I sat perfectly still at the polished oak conference table, my fingers folded calmly in my lap, listening as each name was spoken with careful precision. Daniel Whitmore, my younger brother. Rebecca Whitmore, his wife. A series of charities my father had supported for years. The Whitmore Family Foundation. The Whitmore Manufacturing Company. Every word was delivered clearly, professionally, without hesitation. And yet, the one name I expected to hear never arrived. Margaret Whitmore. My name. My father's only daughter. The room itself was elegant in that quiet, formal way lawyers' offices tend to be. Soft beige walls, framed degrees hanging behind the attorney's desk, a large window overlooking downtown Chicago where the late afternoon sun filtered through thin white blinds. The air smelled faintly of leather and old books. Everything about the setting suggested order, dignity, respect. But beneath that calm surface, something felt wrong. I could feel it the way you sense a sudden drop in temperature before a storm. Michael Carter turned the final page and cleared his throat softly. This concludes the provisions of Mr. Harold Whitmore's will. The silence that followed lasted only a second, but it felt much longer. I heard Rebecca shift in her chair across from me. When I looked up, she was already smiling. Not warmly, not kindly. It was the sort of smile that appears when someone has just confirmed a private victory. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. For a moment, neither of them looked at me. That, more than anything, told me they had expected this outcome. I kept my expression neutral. I had learned long ago that silence often reveals more than questions. Rebecca finally glanced in my direction, her eyes bright with thinly veiled satisfaction. Well, she said lightly, folding her hands on the table. I suppose Dad knew exactly what he was doing. Daniel nodded beside her. He always believed the business should stay with the person who could grow it. His tone was calm, almost rehearsed. I simply gave a small, polite smile, the kind you offer strangers at the grocery store when they hold the door open for you. Inside, however, a quiet confusion was beginning to take shape. My father had spent 40 years building Whitmore Manufacturing from a two-car garage into one of the largest custom equipment suppliers in the Midwest. And for the past 12 years, I had been the one helping him manage the company's operations while his health slowly declined. I had driven him to medical appointments, sat with him through endless consultations with doctors, balanced the books when he grew too tired to review them himself. Daniel, meanwhile, had moved to Phoenix nearly 15 years ago. He visited on holidays, sometimes less. Rebecca usually stayed home. None of that had ever bothered me. Families grow in different directions. Life becomes busy. But my father had always been clear about one thing. He wanted fairness. I could still hear his voice from one quiet evening last spring when we were sitting on the back porch of his lake house outside Milwaukee, watching the sun settle across the water. Margaret, he had said, tapping his cane lightly against the wooden deck, everything I built was for both of you kids. Don't ever forget that. That memory didn't match what had just happened in this room, which meant only one thing. Something about this document didn't make sense. I shifted slightly in my chair and looked again at Michael Carter. The attorney avoided my eyes for a moment, focusing instead on gathering the papers into a neat stack. It was a small gesture, but I noticed it immediately. Lawyers who believe everything is routine don't hesitate like that. Rebecca's voice broke the silence again. Margaret, I hope you're not upset. These things can be complicated. Her tone carried that careful sweetness people use when pretending to offer comfort. Daniel glanced at me now, finally meeting my eyes. There was no apology in his expression, only confidence, perhaps even relief. I held his gaze for a second, then nodded slowly. Of course not, I said calmly. Dad made his decisions. Rebecca's smile widened slightly. The meeting ended a few minutes later. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as everyone stood. Papers were exchanged. Hands were shaken. Everything unfolded with polite professionalism, as though nothing unusual had occurred. But as I stepped toward the office door, one thought remained steady in the back of my mind. My father had many qualities. Careful, methodical, patient, but careless was never one of them. And Harold Whitmore was not the kind of man who forgot his own daughter. The hallway outside Michael Carter's office was quiet except for the distant hum of the elevator and the faint sound of traffic drifting up from the streets below. Downtown Chicago was beginning to slip into the golden light of early evening, the kind of soft glow that usually made the city feel warm and familiar. That afternoon it felt strangely distant, as though I was watching everything through a pane of glass. Daniel and Rebecca walked ahead of me toward the elevators. Rebecca's heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, each step echoing with crisp confidence. Daniel said something to her under his breath, and she laughed quietly, the sound controlled but unmistakably pleased. They did not look back. I did not hurry to catch up. I let a few extra steps of distance remain between us. For years my father had taught me that silence reveals more than conversation ever could. People speak freely when they believe the moment has already passed. When we reached the elevator, Rebecca pressed the button and turned toward me with that same composed expression she had worn during the reading. "Margaret," she said in a voice that sounded almost sympathetic, "I hope you are not taking this personally. Estate planning can be complicated." Her words floated lightly in the air, polished and careful. Daniel crossed his arms and leaned against the wall beside the elevator doors. "Dad made his choices," he added. "He always believed the company needed someone focused on growth." I studied his face for a moment. My younger brother had always been charming when he wanted something. Even as a teenager, he could convince teachers to extend deadlines or persuade neighbors to lend him tools he never returned. That same easy confidence now rested in his eyes. He believed the matter was finished. I gave a small nod. "Of course," I said calmly. Father knew what he was doing. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. We stepped inside, and the ride down to the lobby passed in silence. Rebecca checked her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. Daniel stared at the floor indicator as the numbers slowly descended. 15, 14, 13. The quiet space between us felt heavy with unspoken certainty on their side and unanswered questions on mine. When the doors opened again, the lobby bustled with the familiar rhythm of late afternoon office traffic. Men in dark suits crossed the marble floor with briefcases in hand. A receptionist greeted someone near the entrance. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from a small cafe tucked beside the building's glass doors. Rebecca slipped her phone back into her purse and turned to Daniel with a bright smile. "We should celebrate tonight," she said. "There is that new restaurant on Michigan Avenue, the one everyone keeps talking about." Daniel's expression brightened immediately. "That sounds perfect." They began discussing reservations as they walked toward the exit. Neither of them invited me to join. I stepped outside a few seconds after they did. The cool breeze off Lake Michigan carried the smell of autumn leaves and distant water. Chicago in October had always been my father's favorite time of year. He used to say the city felt sharper then, more honest somehow. Across the street, Daniel was unlocking his car, while Rebecca stood beside him, still talking excitedly about dinner plans and future renovations to the Whitmore office building. I watched them for a moment from the sidewalk. They looked comfortable, relaxed, certain that the future had already been secured. My phone buzzed quietly in my handbag. I glanced down at the screen. A message from Michael Carter appeared, simple and brief. "Margaret, if you have a moment, I would like to speak with you privately before you leave the building." Something about the wording caught my attention. Lawyers are trained to choose their words carefully. They rarely write messages that include uncertainty unless they truly mean it. I looked up again at Daniel and Rebecca. They had already climbed into their car, the engine starting with a smooth hum. Rebecca leaned toward him, saying something that made him laugh. The car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the steady stream of evening traffic. I stood there for a moment longer, feeling the cool wind brush against my coat. My father had spent his entire life planning carefully. Every contract he signed, every expansion he approved, every decision he made for Whitmore Manufacturing had followed the same rule he repeated to me countless times over the years. "Details matter, Margaret," he used to say. "When something does not fit, there is always a reason." I turned back toward the glass doors of the building and walked inside again. If something about that will did not fit, then sooner or later the reason would reveal itself. I stepped back into the building and rode the elevator to the 15th floor again, the quiet mechanical hum filling the small space as the numbers climbed one by one. When the doors opened, the hallway looked exactly the same as before, calm and orderly, yet the atmosphere felt slightly different now. Attorney Michael Carter was standing just outside his office door, his jacket draped neatly over one arm as though he had been waiting. When he saw me approach, he gave a small nod and gestured for me to come inside. The office felt quieter now that Daniel and Rebecca had left. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the wooden floor and settled along the long conference table where we had all been sitting earlier. Carter closed the door behind us gently and took a seat across from me, placing the folder containing the will between his hands. For a few seconds he said nothing. He studied the papers in front of him as though measuring each word he was about to say. Finally he looked up. "Margaret, I hope you will forgive the unusual message. I rarely ask clients to return after a reading like that." I folded my hands calmly on the table. That was exactly why I came back. Something about today did not feel right. Carter nodded slowly. "Your father was one of the most careful men I have ever worked with. In the 23 years I handled legal matters for him, he reviewed every document with extraordinary attention to detail. That is precisely why the contents of this will surprise me." His voice remained professional, but there was a note of uncertainty beneath it. I leaned slightly forward. "My father always believed in fairness." Carter exhaled softly and opened the folder in front of him. Several documents were arranged inside with neat paper clips and handwritten notes along the margins. He slid one sheet across the table, but did not release it immediately. "Before I show you this, I need to explain something. The document read today was delivered to my office roughly 4 months ago. Your father insisted it replace all previous versions of his estate plan. At the time I asked him twice if he wished to review the changes again. He assured me everything was correct. I studied his expression carefully. And yet you still seem uncertain." Carter hesitated for a moment. "Yes, because the instructions he gave me during our last meeting did not match what we read today." A quiet stillness filled the room. Outside the window a bus passed along the street below, its brakes releasing with a soft sigh. Carter finally released the paper and allowed it to slide fully toward me across the table. "This is a copy of the notes from my last in-person meeting with your father." He tapped lightly on the page. "In those notes, he made it very clear that Whitmore Manufacturing was to remain under your supervision." I read the line slowly, the neat handwriting standing out against the legal formatting of the page. "Margaret Whitmore will retain operational control of the company to ensure stability and continuity." The sentence was unmistakable. I looked up again. "Then the will that was read today does not reflect his instructions." Carter nodded once. "That is correct. My father had many habits, but one stood above all others. He never made important decisions in haste. Every contract, every business agreement, every financial document passed through at least 3 careful reviews before he signed his name." Carter closed the folder and rested both hands on top of it. "That is why this situation troubles me. The final version of the will removes you entirely from the inheritance. Not even a personal provision remains. In all my years working with your father, I cannot recall him ever making a decision so abrupt." I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting the information settle quietly into place. Outside the office window the sun had dipped lower over the skyline, painting the buildings in warm amber light. Daniel and Rebecca were probably already seated at their restaurant by now, raising glasses to what they believed was a finished victory. Carter spoke again, more quietly this time. "Margaret, I cannot accuse anyone of wrongdoing without evidence. But something about the sequence of events surrounding this document deserves closer attention." I nodded slowly. "My father used to say that when a detail does not belong in the picture, it usually means the picture has been changed." Carter met my eyes across. "The table." "Exactly. And I believe the version we heard today may not be the whole picture." Michael Carter remained seated across from me with the folder still resting between his hands, the late afternoon light stretching across the conference table as the city outside slowly shifted toward evening. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The quiet in the room felt thoughtful rather than uncomfortable, the kind of silence that appears when two people are carefully examining the same puzzle from different sides. Finally Carter opened the folder again and pulled out another sheet of paper. "Margaret, there is one more detail that may interest you," he said calmly. "This note is from your father's appointment 3 months before he passed away. I remember that meeting clearly because he insisted on reviewing the company structure in great detail." I leaned forward slightly as he placed the page on the table. My father had always approached business discussions with the same patience he used when teaching me how to read financial reports years earlier at the kitchen table of our old house in Evanston. He believed understanding came from careful observation rather than quick conclusions. Carter tapped the corner of the document. During that meeting, your father spoke at length about the future of Whitmore Manufacturing. He was very clear that the company needed stability. His exact words were that the person who had been managing daily operations should continue guiding it. I read the line again. The wording matched exactly what Carter had said earlier. I had been the one running the company offices for the past decade, while my father gradually stepped back from daily responsibilities. Daniel had never shown much interest in the business side of things. When he visited Chicago, he usually stayed only long enough for dinner before flying back to Arizona. That memory surfaced clearly in my mind. Thanksgiving 3 years earlier at my father's lake house near Milwaukee. My father had been sitting at the head of the long wooden dining table while the rest of us finished dessert. Daniel had leaned back in his chair and said casually that manufacturing companies were old-fashioned investments. Rebecca had laughed and suggested the future was in technology startups. My father had only smiled and quietly asked me about the new supply contracts we were negotiating that winter. At the time, I had not thought much about that exchange. Families often have different opinions about business. But now the memory returned with sharper edges. Carter folded his hands again. Margaret, there is another fact worth mentioning. The will that was read today was delivered to my office by courier rather than during a personal meeting. That was unusual for your father. Every previous version had been reviewed face to face. I looked up slowly. Did you speak with him afterward? Carter shook his head. I attempted to call him the following week to confirm the changes, but the call was returned by someone else who said your father was resting and did not wish to be disturbed. The explanation sounded reasonable at the time because I knew he had been dealing with health concerns. The room grew quiet again as the weight of that detail settled between us. My father had always returned important calls personally. He believed responsibility meant answering questions directly rather than letting others speak on his behalf. Carter studied my expression carefully. I cannot say with certainty what happened in the weeks before that document arrived. But your father's habits were consistent for decades. When someone suddenly changes a lifelong pattern, it usually means something influenced the situation. I stood slowly and walked toward the large window overlooking the street below. Cars moved steadily through the downtown traffic, while pedestrians crossed the intersection beneath the fading evening light. Somewhere across the city, Daniel and Rebecca were likely celebrating their good fortune, convinced the future of Whitmore Manufacturing now belonged entirely to them. I rested one hand lightly against the cool glass and remembered something my father once told me during a long drive along Lakeshore Drive many years ago. He had been teaching me how to read balance sheets that day, explaining how small details often reveal larger truths. If something important disappears from a document, Margaret, he had said, it does not mean it never existed. It usually means someone decided it should not be seen. I turned back toward Carter. If my father intended something different, then somewhere there must be proof of it. Carter nodded slowly. That is exactly what I was hoping you might say. I remained standing by the window for a moment longer after Michael Carter finished speaking, watching the steady movement of cars below as the evening traffic slowly thickened along the Chicago streets. The city lights were beginning to flicker on one by one, reflecting against the glass towers across the avenue. It was the kind of quiet transition from afternoon to evening that my father used to appreciate when he was still able to walk through the city without difficulty. He always said the end of the workday revealed more about people than the beginning ever did. When people believed the important part of the day was finished, they became careless with details. I turned back toward the conference table where Carter was carefully organizing the documents inside the folder. The movement of his hands was deliberate and precise, the same careful professionalism he had shown throughout the years he worked with my father. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had slowly been forming since the will had first been read aloud earlier that afternoon. If the document delivered to your office was unusual, who arranged the courier? Carter paused before answering. That detail caught my attention as well. According to the delivery record, the envelope was brought by a private courier service from a local office downtown. The instructions listed your father as the sender, but the paperwork itself was processed by someone else. I walked back to the table and sat down again. Someone else. Carter nodded slowly. Yes. The courier documentation includes a name for the individual who authorized the shipment. He opened the folder once more and removed a small receipt attached to the inside cover. I could see the typed information clearly from where I sat. Rebecca Whitmore. For a moment, the name rested on the page without explanation, as though it had always belonged there. Carter looked up at me carefully. I want to be clear that arranging a delivery does not automatically mean wrongdoing. Your sister-in-law may simply have been assisting your father with administrative details if he was not feeling well. That is certainly possible. I studied the paper quietly. Rebecca had always been helpful when it came to practical matters. She organized family gatherings. She handled travel reservations. She enjoyed planning and managing details that others often overlooked. But there was one thing Rebecca valued, even more than organization. Opportunity. Carter continued speaking. There is also the matter of timing. The document arrived 3 days after your father was admitted to the hospital for observation. I remember the date because it was the same week I attempted to call him and was told he was resting. That detail settled into place beside the others, forming a pattern that felt increasingly difficult to ignore. Rebecca had arranged the courier. The document had arrived while my father was in the hospital. Carter had never spoken directly with him after the changes were delivered. Outside the window, the sky had darkened completely, the city lights now glowing steadily across the skyline. I remembered another conversation with my father from the previous winter. We had been sitting in his office at the Whitmore Manufacturing Building reviewing annual reports when he paused and leaned back in his chair with that thoughtful expression he used when considering long-term plans. Margaret, he had said quietly, businesses survive because someone is always watching the details. The moment people assume everything will simply work out, that is when mistakes appear. I looked again at the courier receipt lying on the table. Rebecca had always watched details very carefully. Carter closed the folder and rested both hands on it once more. Margaret, I cannot reopen the estate proceedings without cause. But if evidence exists that the final document does not represent your father's true instructions, then we have every legal right to investigate further. The key question is whether another version of the will exists that reflects his earlier decisions. I considered that possibility for a moment. My father kept records of everything. Contracts, financial reports, personal letters. His study at the lake house contained file cabinets filled with decades of organized documents. He believed written records protected people from confusion and misinterpretation. If he had prepared a previous version of the will, he would have kept a copy somewhere safe. I reached for my coat resting on the back of the chair. My father kept a private study at the lake house near Milwaukee. He stored many of his personal documents there. Carter's eyes brightened slightly with quiet interest. Then, that would be the logical place to begin. I nodded once, already certain of the decision forming in my mind. If someone had changed the picture, then the original version had to exist somewhere. And if my father had left the truth behind, I intended to find it. I left Michael Carter's office shortly after we finished speaking, carrying with me the quiet certainty that the next answers would not be found in downtown Chicago, but nearly 90 miles north along the lake. The drive to my father's lake house outside Milwaukee had been part of my routine for years, especially during the months when his health had begun to decline and the calm air near the water helped him sleep better than the noise of the city. That evening the highway stretched ahead under a darkening sky, the headlights of passing cars forming long ribbons of white and red along the interstate. The steady rhythm of the road gave my thoughts time to settle into something clearer. Daniel and Rebecca believed the matter had already ended. They believed the future of Whitmore Manufacturing had quietly transferred into their hands with the reading of that document earlier that afternoon. But my father had never allowed important decisions to rest on assumptions. By the time I turned off the highway and followed the narrow road leading toward the lake, the moon had risen high enough to reflect faintly across the water. The house appeared exactly as it always had, a long cedar structure surrounded by tall maple trees that rustled softly in the cool autumn air. My father had purchased the property nearly 30 years earlier when Whitmore Manufacturing first began to grow beyond its small original workshop. He used to say the lake reminded him to slow down and think carefully before making decisions. I parked in the gravel driveway and stepped out of the car, breathing in the quiet scent of pine and cold water drifting from the shoreline a few hundred feet away. The house lights remained off, but the porch lamp glowed automatically as I approached the front steps. My father had installed the motion light himself years earlier after insisting that every home should welcome visitors properly even after dark. Inside, the familiar creak of the wooden floor greeted me as I entered. The air carried the faint scent of old books and cedar shelves. Nothing inside the house had changed since the last time I visited a few weeks before he passed away. His reading chair still faced the large window overlooking the lake. A folded blanket rested neatly across the back as though he might return any moment to continue the novel he had been reading. I paused there briefly, letting the stillness of the room settle around me. For many years this house had been the place where my father thought most clearly about his business decisions and family plans. If he had left something behind to clarify his intentions, it would likely be here. His private study sat at the end of a short hallway beside the kitchen. The door was closed, just as he had always kept it when reviewing company reports late into the night. When I opened it, the soft desk lamp automatically illuminated the room exactly the way he preferred. The desk itself remained perfectly organized. My father believed that a tidy workspace prevented careless thinking. Rows of labeled folders filled the tall metal filing cabinet along the wall, each drawer arranged by year and subject. Contracts, tax records, company reports, personal correspondence. Every category had its place. I walked slowly to the cabinet and opened the top drawer labeled estate documents. Several folders rested inside, each marked with dates written in my father's careful handwriting. I removed the first one and placed it gently on the desk. The papers inside contained insurance policies and property records. Nothing unusual. The second folder held copies of earlier estate plans dating back nearly a decade. I examined each page carefully beneath the desk lamp. Every version listed both Daniel and me as beneficiaries, exactly as my father had always promised. When I reached the final folder at the back of the drawer, I noticed something different immediately. The label read, Personal Review Copy. The folder felt slightly heavier than the others as I opened it. Inside was a document secured with a small brass clip. The date printed at the top of the page was only 3 months old. I read the first line slowly beneath the warm glow of the desk lamp. The document was a complete estate plan bearing my father's unmistakable signature. And unlike the version read earlier that afternoon in Chicago, this one clearly named Margaret Whitmore as the primary successor to Whitmore Manufacturing. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across the old wooden surface as I continued reading the document my father had left inside the folder. Outside the study window, the lake reflected the pale glow of the moon, and the quiet rustling of the trees along the shoreline made the entire house feel still and watchful. My father had always liked working in silence, especially when he was preparing important papers. He used to say that quiet rooms allowed the truth to stand out more clearly than noisy ones. The document in front of me carried the same careful formatting as every legal paper he had ever signed. His full name appeared neatly across the top line, Harold Whitmore. Beneath it was the date printed in bold numbers from 3 months earlier. I slowly turned the pages one by one, reading every paragraph with the same patience he had taught me when reviewing company contracts years ago. There were no sudden changes or confusing instructions in this version. Everything followed the structure my father had always described. Daniel would receive several investment accounts along with the condominium he owned in Phoenix. A number of charitable foundations would continue receiving annual donations through the Whitmore Family Trust. And Whitmore Manufacturing, the company he had spent more than 40 years building, would remain under the leadership of the person he believed understood it best. My name appeared clearly in that section, printed in the same steady lettering as the rest of the document. Margaret Whitmore shall retain full operational authority and controlling ownership of Whitmore Manufacturing Incorporated. I rested my hands lightly on the desk as the meaning of those words settled into place. This version of the will was not vague. It was not uncertain. It reflected exactly what my father had explained during our conversations over the past decade. The company was not simply an inheritance. It was a responsibility. My father believed businesses survived through careful leadership, not through sudden transfers of control to people unfamiliar with their daily operations. I reached the final page and saw the signature I had recognized immediately when I first opened the folder. My father's handwriting had always been firm and precise. Even in his later years when his health had begun to weaken, he never allowed his signature to appear rushed or careless. Beneath his name were the signatures of 2 witnesses along with the official notary seal confirming the document had been properly verified. Everything about the paper suggested preparation and certainty. Nothing about it resembled the strange version that had been read earlier in Chicago. I leaned back slowly in the chair and allowed the quiet of the study to fill the room again. Somewhere in the distance, a small wave rolled gently against the rocks along the lake shore. The sound reminded me of a conversation my father and I had shared in this very room nearly a year earlier. We had been reviewing production forecasts for the following spring when he suddenly closed the folder in front of him and looked directly at me with that calm, thoughtful expression he often used when explaining important lessons. "Margaret," he had said, "the strength of a business is not measured by how quickly it grows. It is measured by how carefully the people running it protect what already exists." I had nodded then, understanding exactly what he meant. Whitmore Manufacturing had survived economic downturns, changing markets, and fierce competition because my father never allowed short-term excitement to replace long-term stability. That same principle had guided every document he prepared, including this while resting on the desk before me. I gathered the pages carefully and placed them back inside the folder. The answer we had been searching for was now clear. The document read during the meeting that afternoon did not represent my father's final intentions. Somewhere between the moment this version had been signed and the moment the courier delivered a different envelope to Michael Carter's office, something had changed. I looked once more around the quiet study, at the orderly shelves and carefully labeled files that reflected my father's lifelong respect for detail. He had left behind everything needed to understand the truth. The only remaining question was how Daniel and Rebecca had managed to replace it. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back inside the drawer exactly where I had found it, leaving the study lamp on for a moment longer as I stood beside my father's desk. The quiet of the lake house felt different now, no longer filled only with memories, but with a sense of direction. The truth was no longer uncertain. The document in Chicago had been replaced, and someone had taken the trouble to make sure the replacement arrived at the right time, through the right courier, while my father was too ill to confirm the change himself. I switched off the lamp and walked slowly through the hallway toward the living room. The moonlight spilling through the large windows reflected across the lake outside, turning the water into a wide sheet of silver that stretched toward the dark tree line on the far shore. My father had always loved that view. When business problems grew complicated, he would stand at that same window for several minutes without speaking, studying the quiet surface of the lake as though it helped him sort through his thoughts. I understood that habit better now. Sometimes the clearest decisions come after the noise fades away. I spent the night at the lake house, sleeping in the small guest room near the back porch where I had stayed many times during the past few years. The next morning the air smelled fresh and cold when I stepped outside with a cup of coffee in my hands. A light mist hovered above the water, and the distant call of a boat engine echoed somewhere across the lake. The calm morning gave me time to plan the next step carefully. My father had never rushed important decisions. If someone had altered the will, then exposing that truth required patience rather than anger. After breakfast, I drove back toward Chicago with the folder secured safely inside my briefcase on the passenger seat. Traffic moved steadily along the highway as commuters returned to the city for the start of another workday. By the time I reached Michael Carter's office again, the sun had climbed high above the skyline, and the sidewalks were crowded with office workers carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Carter was waiting for me when I stepped into his office. His expression changed immediately when he saw the folder in my hands. "You found something," he said quietly. I placed the document on the table and opened it beneath the bright office lights. The pages looked even clearer in daylight, every line of text precise and unmistakable. Carter read the document slowly from beginning to end without interrupting. When he reached the final page with my father's signature and the official notary seal, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "This changes everything," he said. I nodded. "It also explains why Rebecca arranged the courier." Carter folded his hands together thoughtfully. "If this document was signed 3 months ago and properly witnessed, then it is legally stronger than the version delivered to my office. But we must present it carefully. Accusations without proof of intent can complicate the process." I understood exactly what he meant. Daniel and Rebecca believed they had already secured the inheritance. They were confident because the document read aloud the previous day appeared legitimate. That confidence could become useful. Let them believe the situation remains unchanged, I said calmly. Carter studied me for a moment before a faint smile appeared on his face. You want them comfortable before we reveal the truth. Exactly. My father had always believed that the most revealing moment in any negotiation comes when the other side believes they have already won. Carter closed the folder gently and placed it inside his briefcase. Then we should arrange a second meeting. A formal clarification of the estate documents. I looked toward the large window behind his desk where the busy streets of Chicago stretched across the city below. Somewhere out there, Daniel and Rebecca were probably already making plans for the company they thought belonged to them. They had not yet realized that my father had left behind something far more powerful than assumptions. He had left the truth in writing. 2 days later, Michael Carter arranged a formal meeting in the same conference room where the will had first been read. The morning sunlight entered through the tall windows behind his desk, reflecting across the polished oak table exactly as it had during the previous gathering. When Daniel and Rebecca walked into the room, their expressions carried the same relaxed confidence I had seen when they left the building earlier that week. Rebecca greeted Carter warmly as though nothing unusual had occurred since the original reading. Daniel gave me a brief nod and sat down across the table, his posture casual, almost satisfied. I remained quiet, folding my hands in front of me the way my father had always done during important discussions. Carter began the meeting with the same professional tone he used during the first reading. Thank you for coming back today. There is a small matter regarding the estate documents that requires clarification before the probate filing can proceed. Rebecca glanced at Daniel and then back at Carter with a polite smile. Clarification. That sounds routine. Carter nodded slightly and opened the briefcase resting beside his chair. The room remained silent except for the soft sound of papers being placed carefully on the table. I watched Daniel's expression as Carter positioned the document directly beneath the light. At first he seemed only mildly curious. Then his eyes moved across the first page and his posture slowly straightened. Rebecca leaned forward slightly, her confident expression tightening as she began reading the same lines. Carter spoke calmly while they examined the pages. This document was discovered in Harold Whitmore's personal study at the lake house. It is dated 3 months before his passing and contains his full signature, 2 witness signatures, and a verified notary seal. Daniel looked up immediately. That is impossible. Carter did not raise his voice. On the contrary, it is quite possible. The document appears to be your father's personal review copy, which means it was retained after the signing for his records. Rebecca's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the table. But the will you read earlier this week? Carter raised one hand gently to pause her sentence. The will delivered to my office by courier was indeed read during the original meeting. However, the law requires that the most recent validly signed version be recognized when multiple documents exist. He allowed a moment of silence to settle over the room before continuing. Based on the dates and verification seals, the version discovered at the lake house carries stronger legal authority. Daniel's expression had shifted from confidence to confusion. He flipped through the pages again as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more favorable. Rebecca remained very still, her eyes moving slowly across each line of text. Carter spoke again with the same calm professionalism. As you can see, Whitmore Manufacturing remains under the operational authority and controlling ownership of Margaret Whitmore according to this document. Rebecca finally looked up, her voice quieter than before. But that is not what. She stopped speaking when she realized the sentence could not be finished. I simply sat there and watched them absorb the information. My father had always believed that truth rarely needed dramatic speeches to make itself understood. It only needed to be placed clearly in front of the right people. Carter gathered the papers neatly into a stack. In light of this discovery, the probate filing will proceed according to the terms written here. All corporate authority remains unchanged under Margaret Whitmore's leadership. The rest of the room remained silent. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair, staring at the document as though it had appeared from nowhere. Rebecca's earlier confidence had disappeared entirely, replaced by a careful stillness that revealed how quickly circumstances can shift when assumptions collapse. I rose from my chair and adjusted my coat, feeling the calm certainty my father had always carried when he finished an important negotiation. Before leaving the room, I looked once more at the document resting on the table. My father had always trusted written truth more than spoken promises. That quiet piece of paper had protected everything he spent a lifetime building.